morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching or listening. My name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. And today, ladies and gentlemen, long awaited, the ending installation or excerpt for the Federalist Papers number 85 is going to be the topic of today's lecture. Now, if you haven't gone back and watched 1 through 84, I know they're on the longer side, about 20 minutes each, but one of the frequent criticisms from the late and great Justice Antonin Scalia about the modern legal education system is that they don't really teach the Federalist Papers. So understanding the Federalist Papers in addition to the anti-Federalist Papers will provide you a very advantageous, very well-rounded understanding of the U.S. Constitution, and of course, understanding the U.S. Constitution is absolutely necessary to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So let's go ahead and jump on over to the Federalist Papers. The version I'm using is provided by the federalistpapersproject.org, but there are multiple institutions from which you can get a paper and digital copy. Go ahead and get both. And if you haven't done so already, go ahead and get a paper and digital copy of the anti-Federalist Papers so you can join us in comparing and contrasting the arguments for and against ratifying the U.S. Constitution. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the last Federalist paper, we're going to, of course, do as per the tradition, a recap lecture on all of the different Federalist Papers. Of course, we're not going to be reading through all of them. That would be a 26 hour stream. I'm not going to do that. We're just going to go over the main topics, of course, that are associated with each of the Federalist Papers numbers. So that way you can kind of quickly reference them in the forefront of your mind. Okay, so number 85, aptly titled, is titled Concluding Remarks. Written by Mr. Alexander Hamilton, so he had the last word, unfortunately. But he had the last word regarding the Federalists' position, kind of per curiam position, as to why the U.S. Constitution, this new government, ought to be ratified and obeyed. It was published in the Independent Journal on Wednesday, August 13th, Saturday, and August 16th, 1788. So Wednesday, August 13th, and Saturday, August 16th of 1788. It says this. To the people of the state of New York, according to the formal division of the subject of these papers, announced in my first number, there would appear still to remain for discussion 2 points. Quote, the analogy of the proposed government to your own state constitution, and, quote, the additional security which its adoption will afford to Republican government, to liberty and to property. But these heads have been so fully anticipated and exhausted in the progress of the work that it would now scarcely be possible to do anything more than repeat in a more dilated form what has been heretofore said, with the advanced stage of the question and the time already spent upon it, conspired to forbid. It is remarkable that the resemblance of the plan of the convention to the act which organizes the government of this state holds, not less with regard to many of the supposed defects than to the real excellences of the former. Among the pretended defects are the re-eligibility of the executive, the want of a council, the omission of a formal Bill of Rights, the omission of a provision respecting the liberty of the press. These and several others which have been noted in the course of our inquiries are as much chargeable on the existing constitution of this state as on the one proposed for the Union. He's saying it's redundant to want to include these things. And a man must have slender pretensions to consistency who can rail at the latter for imperfections which he finds no difficulty in excusing in the former. See how he always does that. Always attacks the individual. It's ad hominem. Nor indeed can there be a better proof of the insincerity and affectation of some of the zealous adversaries of the plan of the convention among us, who profess to be the devoted admirers of the government under which they live, than the fury with which they have attacked that plan for matters in regard to which our own constitution is equally or perhaps more vulnerable. So not only is it silly to critique this proposed government, it's silly because it's so incredibly similar to the government that's already imposed. It was so similar to what the Articles of the Confederation already were. If that's the case, then a lot of the applications and a lot of the understandings that we have about the U.S. Constitution today are completely and holistically flawed, because virtually everything the Union government does today is completely contrary to the powers allotted to it in the Articles of the Confederation. So, no, Mr. Hamilton, the similarities are not as striking and not as apparent. The additional securities to Republican government, to liberty, and to property, be derived from the adoption of the plan under consideration consist chiefly in the restraints which the preservation of the Union will impose on local factions and insurrections, and on the ambition of powerful individuals in single states who may acquire credit and influence enough from leaders and favorites to become the despots of the people, and the diminution of the opportunities to foreign intrigue which the dissolution of the Confederacy would invite and facilitate, and the prevention of extensive military establishments which could not fail to grow out of wars between the states in a disunited nation situation. Oh, thank goodness the new government came in, otherwise we may have had a civil war. In the express guarantee of a republican form of government to each, in the absolute and but wait, Mr. Hamilton, we're a democracy. That's what I always hear every federal politician say. We have to save democracy. Well, even Hamilton saying here, let's go ahead and highlight it just because I'm making a point about it. We'll go ahead and highlight here. Even Hamilton, the one who would be most in favor of something like a democracy, is saying expressly the U.S. Constitution provides for a republican form of government to each of the states. In the absolute and universal exclusion of titles of nobility, and in the precautions against the repetition of those practices on the part of the state governments which have undermined the foundations of property and credit, have planted mutual distrust in the breasts of all classes of citizens, and have occasioned an almost universal prostration of morals. Thus have I, fellow citizens, executed the task I had assigned to myself. Ah, thank goodness, a self-proclaimed successful individual. With what success your conduct must determine. I trust at least you will admit that I have not failed in the assurance I gave you respecting the spirit with which my endeavors should be conducted. Au contraire, I have addressed myself purely to your judgments and have studiously avoided those asperities which are too apt to disgrace political disputants of all parties, and which have been not a little provoked by the language and conduct of the opponents of the Constitution. The charge of a conspiracy against the liberties of the people, which has been indiscriminately brought against the advocates of the plan, has something in it too wanton and too malignant not to excite the indignation of every man who feels in his own bosom a refutation of the calumny. The perpetual changes which have been rung upon the wealthy, the well-born, and the great have been such as to inspire the disgust of all sensible men, and the unwarrantable concealments and misrepresentations which have been in various ways practiced to keep the truth from the public eye have been of a nature to demand the reprobation of all honest men. It is not impossible that these circumstances may have occasionally betrayed me into intemperances of expression which I did not intend. Oh, you knew what you were doing. It is certain that I have frequently felt a struggle between sensibility and moderation. I mean, just think about that for a second. Ponder what he just said there. He let his viscerality, he let his emotions take control. And that's the best purview of what he just admitted there. Sometimes he expressed himself in ways he did not intend to because of just how impossible, how absurd some of the objections were to the proposed government. So you have an individual who's influencing the government who can't keep his mind, who can't keep his rationality or his logic in line. There is no favorable outlook for Mr. Hamilton after realizing exactly what he admitted in that sentence. It is certain that I have frequently felt a struggle between sensibility and moderation, and if the former has in some instances prevailed, it must be my excuse that it has been neither often nor much. Let us now pause and ask ourselves whether in the course of these papers the proposed Constitution has not been satisfactorily vindicated from the aspersions thrown upon it, and whether it has not been shown to be worthy of the public approbation and necessary to the public safety and prosperity. Every man is bound to answer these questions to himself according to the best of his conscience and understanding, and to act agreeably to the genuine and sober dictates of his judgment. This is a duty from which nothing can give him a dispensation. It is one that he is called upon, nay, constrained by all the obligations that form the bands of society to discharge sincerely and honestly. No partial motive, no particular interest, no pride of opinion, no temporary passion or prejudice will justify to himself, to his country, or to his posterity an improper election of the part he is to act. Let him beware of an obstinate adherence to party. Let him reflect that the object upon which he is to decide is not a particular interest of the community, but the very existence of the nation, and let him remember that a majority of America has already given its sanction to the plan which he is to approve or reject. That is not true, not remotely true. In fact, the vast majority was against ratifying the U.S. Constitution. They only had 39 of the 70 delegates vote to ratify the U.S. Constitution, barely over half. So when I say the vast majority, I'm talking about the population, talking about the citizens. And the reason for that is because Thomas Jefferson was such an avid dissent against the U.S. Constitution as it stood. Now, of course, he was willing to make concessions if the Bill of Rights was to be included preemptively, prerequisitely, not as amendments, but as required inclusions. But even after that, individuals like Patrick Henry, George Mason, John Dickinson were constantly vocalizing against ratifying the U.S. Constitution. I shall not dissemble that I feel an entire confidence in the arguments which recommend the proposed system to your adoption, and that I am unable to discern any real force in those by which it has been opposed. I am persuaded it is the best which our political situation, habits, and opinions will admit, and superior to any the Revolution has produced. You kidding me? To that I'll say what Patrick Henry said. If the Articles of Confederation were strong enough to win against the greatest empire of the time, how could they not be good enough to govern in a time of peace? The Articles of the Confederation, that is. Concessions on the part of the friends of the plan, that it has not a claim to absolute perfection, have afforded matter of no small triumph to its enemies. Why, say they, should we adopt an imperfect thing? Why not amend it and make it perfect before it is irrevocably established? A very good question. There was no need to rush. This may be plausible enough, but it is only plausible. In the first place, I remarked that the extent of these concessions has been greatly exaggerated. They have been stated as amounting to an admission that the plan is radically defective, and that without material alterations, the rights and the interests of the community cannot be safely confided to it. This, as far as I have understood, the meaning of those who make the concessions is an entire perversion of their sense. No advocate of the measure can be found who will not declare as his sentiment that the system, though it may not be perfect in every part, is, upon the whole, a good one, is the best that the present views and circumstances of the country will permit, and is such an one as promises every species of security which a reasonable people can desire. So you're unreasonable if you dare detest or dissent against this proposed government. I answer in the next place that I should esteem it in the extreme of imprudence to prolong the precarious state of our national affairs, and to expose the Union to the jeopardy of successive experiments in the chimerical pursuit of a perfect plan. Why? Why? That's the whole point of having an amendment process, so that way you don't have to replace the government entirely every single time something supposedly bad comes about. I never expect to see a perfect work from imperfect man. The result of the deliberations of all collective bodies must necessarily be a compound as well of the errors and prejudices as of the good sense and wisdom of the individuals of whom they are composed. The compacts which are to embrace 13 distinct states in a common bond of amity and union must as necessarily be a compromise of as many dissimilar interests and inclinations. How can perfection spring from such materials? They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for minute, not macro. They're looking for minor adjustments, not complete restructuring of governments. And that's exactly what the U.S. Constitution was in purview of the Articles of the Confederation. It was a completely different government, one with a king. I mean, we call him president, but he's a king. He wields the sword. The reasons assigned in an excellent little pamphlet lately published in this city are unanswerable to show the utter improbability of assembling a new convention under circumstances in any degree so favorable to a happy issue as those in which the late convention met, deliberated, and concluded. So it doesn't matter that they didn't follow the rules of the Articles of Confederation, which was getting unanimous agreement between 13 states. It doesn't matter. We're gonna break and change that rule without the proper amendment process because we have to. That is a government of men, not laws. I will not repeat the arguments there used, as I presume the production itself has had an extensive circulation. It is certainly well worthy the perusal of every friend to his country. There is, however, one point of light in which the subject of amendments still remains to be considered, and in which it has not yet been exhibited to public view. I cannot resolve to conclude without first taking a survey of it in this aspect. It appears to me susceptible of absolute demonstration that it will be far more easy to obtain subsequent than previous amendments to the Constitution. The moment an alteration is made in the present plan, it becomes to the purpose of adoption a new one, and must undergo a new decision of each state. To its complete establishment throughout the Union, it will therefore require the concurrence of 13 states. He's already... I like that. That is so important. He knew. They knew. They knew unanimous agreement had to be reached, and they didn't get it. So the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, did not pass. It was not ratified. Well, Caleb, 9 of the 13 states. Is that 13 of the 13 states? Even if you have 12.5 of the states, still not 13 states. The U.S. Constitution was never ratified. It's never been ratified. They didn't ratify it at the convention. They didn't ratify it years later. They knew. To its complete establishment throughout the Union, it will therefore require the concurrence of 13 states. They knew. If, on the contrary, the Constitution proposed should once be ratified by all the states as it stands, alterations in it may at any time be effected by 9 states. I've looked far and wide. There were no secession letters from any of the 13 states breaking away from the Articles of the Confederation before establishing the U.S. Constitution. They intentionally broke the rules to implement this very flawed, very faulty, very legalese-infused government. And they knew it. Here, then the chances are as 13-9 in favor of subsequent amendment rather than of the original adoption of an entire system. He knew. He's admitting that he didn't get the required votes, that he couldn't get the required votes, and that even in 1789 he would not get the required votes to ratify the U.S. Constitution. He knew. This is not all. Every constitution for the United States must inevitably consist of a great variety of particulars in which 13 independent states are to be accommodated in their interests or opinions of interest. We may, of course, expect to see in any body of men charged with its original formation very different combinations of the parts upon different points. Many of those who form a majority on one question may become the minority on a second, and an association dissimilar to either may constitute the majority on a third. Hence the necessity of molding and arranging all the particulars which are to compose the whole in such a manner as to satisfy all the parties to the compact, and hence also an immense multiplication of difficulties and casualties in obtaining the collective assent to a final act. The degree of that multiplication must evidently be in a ratio to the number of particulars and the number of parties. But every amendment to the Constitution, if once established, would be a single proposition and might be brought forward singly. There would then be no necessity for management or compromise in relation to any other point, no giving nor taking. The will of the requisite number would at once bring the matter to a decisive issue, and consequently, whenever 9 or rather 10 states were united in the desire of a particular amendment, that amendment must infallibly take place. There can, therefore, be no comparison between the facility of effecting an amendment and that of establishing in the first instance a complete constitution. This right here, the 9 or the 10 states getting to impose an amendment on the other, is that exact adage, that wise axiom that says democracy is 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for supper. It's so cliche, but still so true. That's why it's cliche. Does that sound fair? What would you say if the United Nations did that? I mean, they do. But what would you say? Like the carbon tax. They imposed it. The U.S. is still a member of the UN. So are you going to take Hamilton's theory here, his doctrine? Are you going to whine, cry, and shout, but ultimately comply because you have to, pursuant to his theory? This is democracy, where the majority crumbles, where the majority reigns over the minority. The Articles of the Confederation, that was Republican government. Where no matter how small, whether geographically speaking or population-wise, you still had an equal determination in how the Union was going to be governed. Do you want democracy, where you're the lamb? Or do you want the Republican form of government, where you're the lamb, but with a firearm? You have to take a pick. You can't have both. And if you want to be the lamb with a firearm, you cannot support the U.S. Constitution, because it was never ratified. The rules of the Union were broken to impose the U.S. Constitution. The trust, the naivete of the citizens of the states is how the U.S. Constitution was imposed, not ratified. In opposition to the probability of subsequent amendments, it has been urged that the persons delegated to the administration of the national government will always be disinclined to yield up any portion of the authority of which they were once possessed. For my own part, I acknowledge a thorough conviction that any amendments which may, upon mature consideration, be thought useful will be applicable to the organization of the government, not to the mass of its powers, and on this account alone, I think there is no weight in the observation just stated. I also think that there is little weight in it, on another account. The intrinsic difficulty of governing 13 states at any rate, independent of calculations upon an ordinary degree of public spirit and integrity, will, in my opinion, constantly impose on the national rulers the necessity of a spirit of accommodation to the reasonable expectations of their constituents. It wasn't to govern the 13 states. It was to do two things. Three, if you want to get into the vague legal ambiguity of general welfare, but it was to do two things. Make sure the states don't kill each other. Make sure the states don't get killed by foreign powers. That's it. That is the only purpose. Those are the only purposes for the Union government. Everything outside of that is completely outside the scope, outside the realm the framers had for the Union government. The states were to remain sovereign. States were to remain independent and conduct their affairs as they so elected. The Union government was to deal with foreign affairs and to make sure the states didn't kill each other. That's it. But there is yet a further consideration which proves beyond the possibility of a doubt that the observation is futile. It is this, that the national rulers, whenever 9 states concur, will have no option upon the subject. By the 5th Articles of the plan, the Congress will be obliged, quote, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, which at present amount to 9, to call a convention for proposing amendments which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof. The words of this article are peremptory. The Congress, quote, shall call a convention. Nothing in this particular is left to the discretion of that body. What a liar. And of course, all the declamation about the disinclination to a change vanishes in air. Nor, however difficult it may be supposed to unite 2/3 or 3/4 of the state legislatures in amendments which may affect local interests, can there be any room to apprehend any such difficulty in a union on points which are merely relative to the general liberty or security of the people? Are you kidding me? Do you know how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were ratified? The dissent was slaughtered. The state legislatures made multiple changes to the amendment text. But then when the submissions were made to Congress, they said, surely those were just misspellings. Oh, there's a comma missing there. There's a semicolon missing there. No big deal. Or rather, they inserted a comma or a semicolon. No big deal. That's virtually ratifying it. So we'll just count them in as adopting it. No, that's not how Article 5 works. But they don't care. That's what the Anti-Federalist Papers were saying. If only men were angels. If only men would follow rules. but they don't. So take away as much power as you possibly can from them to govern others' affairs. We may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority. Nope. Nope. Be honest with yourself. How interwoven are you with your state legislature? Do you know your state representatives? And don't bash yourself for it. Don't scorn yourself for it, because it's by design that you don't know who your state legislators are, that you don't know who your governor is, that you don't know when the next convention is going to be called for your state legislature. It's by design that you focus exclusively on the federal government. You may know who your U.S. congressmen are, your senators, your reps. You may even know the 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. Does your state have a Supreme Court? What are the names of the justices on that court? Is it bifurcated? Let's reread that part. We may safely rely. Presumably. Thank goodness we can safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority. Thank goodness we have the state legislatures to keep us from federal encroachment. But we don't. The Anti-Federalists called that out. They prophesied that. They predicted it. If the foregoing argument is a fallacy, certain it is that I am myself deceived by it, for it is, in my conception, one of those rare instances in which a political truth can be brought to the test of a mathematical demonstration. Those who see the matter in the same light with me, however zealous they may be for amendments, must agree in the propriety of a previous adoption as the most direct road to their own object. The zeal for attempts to amend prior to the establishment of the Constitution must abate in every man who is ready to accede to the truth of the following observations of a writer equally solid and ingenious. Quote, to balance a large state or society, says he, whether monarchical or republican, on general laws is a work of so great difficulty that no human genius, however comprehensive, is able, by the mere dint of reason and reflection, to effect it. The judgments of many must unite in the work. Experience must guide their labor. Time must bring it to perfection, and the feeling of inconveniences must correct the mistakes which they inevitably fall into in their first trials and experiments. These judicious reflections contain a lesson of moderation to all the sincere lovers of the Union, and ought to put them upon their guard against hazarding anarchy, civil war. What happens just 80 years after this? A perpetual alienation of the states from each other, and perhaps the military despotism of a victorious demagogue, and the pursuit of what they are not likely to obtain but from time and experience. It may be in me a defect of political fortitude, but I acknowledge that I cannot entertain an equal tranquility with those who affect to treat the dangers of a longer continuance in our present situation as imaginary. A nation without a national government is, in my view, an awful spectacle. It's not a nation. Even you, Hamilton, said that. Not a nation, not a country, not a state, a union. The establishment of a constitution in time of profound peace by the voluntary consent of a whole people is a prodigy, to the completion of which I look forward with trembling anxiety. I reconcile it to no rules of prudence to let go the hold we now have in so arduous an enterprise upon 7 out of the 13 states. And after having passed over so considerable a part of the ground to recommence the course, I dread the more the consequences of new attempts, because I know that powerful individuals in this and in other states are enemies to a general national government in every possible shape. Golly gee, I wonder why. It's really hard to keep my tongue whenever reading through Hamilton's papers, because he's so pompous, he's so pretentious the way he writes, and the way he conducts his ad hominem to dispel any sort of dissenting, very justified, rational dissenting opinions against the U.S. Constitution was just, it's gut-wrenching. Anyway, if you have any questions about what Mr. Hamilton was saying there in number 85, maybe you have questions about what was said in papers 1 through 84, or there's a topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, go ahead and post those down in the comments, because The entire purpose of the Calhoun School of Law is to provide you with the necessary skills and information to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So please, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and post them down in the comments. Excellent. So my name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if not, while you're down in the comments, go ahead and let me know how I can do better so I can best serve that purpose of helping you. I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and I'm not sure what the topic for the next lecture is going to be, but I'll do my best to make it as informative and entertaining as this one, if not more so. Also, give yourself a quick pat on the back for making it through all of the Federalist Papers. These are going to be, these are going to be greatly to your advantage. Anyway, regardless of the topic of the next lecture, until I see y'all then, I bid you all farewell.